Well,
right.
thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, this topic is trust, and it seems to be the hot topic here at Davos this week in all kinds of areas.
Absolutely. I think you see it, as we discussed earlier. It runs through human rights. It runs through the purpose and mission of the company, and obviously runs to this issue around using employee data.
It does, but back to human rights, because that is a very interesting topic here around the streets this week. What were you doing earlier? I thought that was interesting.
So we had a panel. Our CEO was one of the featured panelists on a CNN.
And your CEO is?
Antonio Neri. We had a panel hosted by CNN on the Stop Slavery movement. We've been a leader in that space, I'm proud to say, over a number of years. First starting with conflict minerals, but really working walking into the entire part of the supply chain, migrant worker protection, and so forth. So it's an issue that we're passionate about. We're glad to be a leader in, and I think it certainly has helped build trust in our employees that we're a company that looks to advance the way people live and work.
And I think it's important because it enables you to start this whole conversation about the workforce DNA from a basis of trust. You have some level of trust with your people already.
Yeah, I like to think of it as trust is that thread that runs through all of these things. Absolutely. And if you cut it in one place, it runs the rest of everything unravels. So you need to have the employees' trust in how you're using their data, but you also have their trust in who you do business with and how you do business. And I don't think you can pick and choose to be more trustworthy in one spot and less trustworthy in another one.
That just doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It does not.
And I think, we have found that trust is really the ultimate currency, and it does span every aspect of your relationship with not only your people, but people you're trying to recruit into your organization. So
I think I'm sure in some regards the situation that existed 20 and 30 years ago was overstated, but it does seem like at that point in time, if there was a word, it would have been loyalty.
Yeah.
Companies were loyal to the employees were loyal to the company, and sometimes in both instances to a fault. I think that's changed, and it's been replaced with this idea of earned trust on both sides. And that's why I agree with you. I think that is really today's currency.
I've had the opportunity to spend some time with the Global Shapers who were co-chairing the forum this week, and trust is front and center on their mind on sustainability issues, on human rights issues, on workforce issues. So it's a good topic.
It is. I think it's also interesting. We've seen different statistics thrown around, and we were laughing about it earlier that people may not trust business as a whole, but they trust the business they work for.
Yeah.
I analogized it to the old saying: "People don't like lawyers, but they love their lawyer." But I think this is a period of time where you see more and more distrust of lots of institutions, right? All you have to do is look at the situation with the U.S. government, and the president ranks very low in terms of overall trust, but Congress is even lower. So we're in a situation where it feels like there's a trust gap in lots of other places.
Yeah.
And I think that increases the importance around having trust between the employer and the employee, because in some regards, maybe outside the family, it's the strongest trust bond that exists.
Yeah, and we saw that with the Edelman Trust Barometer this week. But getting to the topic at hand, which is workforce DNA, and lots of data that has existed and new forms of data that do exist now, whether it be through sensors or wearables or other things, and really ensuring that you use the data in a responsible way is something I know you've been thinking a lot about.
Absolutely. I think we're just touching the surface of, or scratching the surface of the availability of data that can be used to help employees in their everyday life. Two areas that we're specifically focused on at the moment are on the learning and development side, and skill development, and the feeling of employees that they're being invested in these days is incredibly important. And if you can do that in a smarter way, taking the information about where they're spending their time, what they're interested in, and then using that to continue to generate more tailored content is obviously all good. We call that program Accelerated You. And that one, I think, really carries very few trust issues because it's really based on them wanting to consume it, and it is purely a sort of an additive type of a situation. The second one is an area that we call the employee experience, something that
another hot topic.
Another hot topic. Our own data suggests that outside of compensation and work-life balance, the most important thing to employee is the experience they have in the workplace. It can be the physical surroundings, it can be the amenities, whether it's food or yoga classes or pet care. It's the technology, it's what they see in the walls, and it's what they hear in the elevator. And so we are very focused in that area and are looking to increase the data we have available to us in order to make better judgments about what's going to serve our employees.
I think that's interesting because you're at the front end of a new step in your journey.
Yep.
So from skills development to employee experience.
Yep.
So what are the things that are on your mind that you're thinking about as you look to collect more data
Sure.
about your people and their work?
Top of the list right now is what would be technology that allows us to capture how our employees use our space. How do they move through the space on a daily basis? I think from a trust perspective, it is a less invasive type of technology because right now our intention is to use anonymized data, so it's not personal to any individual. We really just need to see usage patterns, and we need to understand by job code. Obviously you want to know whether it's an R&D engineer or whether it's an attorney so that you get to understand what the work style is and therefore what would be important to them in the experience.
Yeah, what would be the baseline? Yeah.
Over time, I do see those types of technologies and other areas. You were mentioning to me things that you're doing in skill development around services where it does become personal to the individual. And I think that is a very critical piece. Not unlike what we've seen around consumer consent for data. When you're dealing with something on an anonymized basis, it carries obviously a different level of risk than when you can actually attribute it to a person and make judgments about them that they may not agree with or may not want you to make. I think that's when, from a governance and a trust perspective, you need to have a whole different approach.
Yeah, and I think that what we have found with our people is that it's true transparency that builds that trust. What are we collecting? What are we collecting it for? And here's what it looks like. That enables you to, give them back benefits from having the data. And I think it's a very complex issue to face, and one that I don't think any C-suite executive should face alone. I think having a coalition of people to help you think about it, but also include the employees in that thinking is.
So we've been looking at this at the leadership level, so across the EC. And involving everyone, from the business to the functions, and we've certainly been getting input from the employees. So I agree with you. You need to do it as a coalition. If we were picking a second C, communication is clearly critical, and I think these are the types of things that you can't communicate enough about.
So what about the third C, consent?
Yeah. So I think that is always a critical factor. I do think that if you think about it from again, kind of coming back to the consumer context, where you're using it on an anonymized basis, I think you can be more comfortable not asking for consent, but I still think transparency and communication is needed. I do think anytime you're moving into something where you're using that data with respect to a particular individual based on that data, I think you need consent. And we also talked about a fourth C, which I think is important, which is correction.
Yeah.
Giving them access to the data and allowing them to comment on it and maybe correct it, because we all know that the data doesn't always tell the whole story. And so giving folks access to it and allowing them to correct it is also a good practice.
I mean, that's those last two C's, consent and correct, are ones that there's not universal agreement around. Why do you think there might be resistance on other organizations' parts to allow that?
It's a good question. Obviously, hard to say in any particular situation. It feels a little bit like expediency, honestly. I do think that, as we discussed on the trust side, we ought to be willing to share with the employees what we're collecting, why we're collecting it. And if we're not willing to do that, then we should be asking ourselves, why are we collecting it? Yeah. In the ethics compliance world, we always call it, the headlines test. Don't do something you wouldn't be willing to see on the front page of the newspaper. I think in this space, we really ought to use the test that says, don't do something you wouldn't be willing to tell the employees about and show them. So I can't speak to why, in a case where you're using personalized data, you wouldn't at least sort of seek the consent and correct opportunity.
I think it's going to be an interesting road to navigate because there's upside to be gained from using the data and using it responsibly, but there's also downside, and to rush in and not really be highly confident that you're using the data responsibly, you can experience true downside
Absolutely.
Economics, but taking more time might not feel like the right thing to do for organizations either. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds, and I hope that that consent and conversation around what the data is being used for and what it is, but also using the data, as you said, to elevate people rather than to punish them is going to be the very basis of what organizations can do to build trust with their people.
Look, whether you're talking about trust in the context of employee data or you're talking about trust from an ethics compliance perspective, we all are acutely aware of the fact that the 100 good things we do get immediately undone by the one bad thing we do. And I think this employee data piece is the same thing. If at the end of the day you create a breach of trust, you've probably undone those benefits and you've lost the presumption of goodwill that is really, really hard to recover.
I couldn't agree more. And with that, I want to thank you very much for coming. I can't think of a better place to have a conversation like this with a person like you. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks again for the opportunity.
I appreciate it.